I started taking pictures back in the late 1970s with an East German film camera, and the time between taking the picture and getting to see the results was typically 4 to 5 days at best. So there was considerable pressure to learn the relationship between the camera settings and the ultimate image that you obtain. Film was expensive, the delay was considerable. When digital SLRs came along, I for one breathed a huge sigh of relief and acquired initially a Nikon D70. Now that cut down the delay between pressing the button and seeing the image to a fraction of a second. I could look at the image on the back of the camera and pretty soon get an impression of whether or not that was a decent image. That caused a certain amount of upset amongst the purists, who didn't like the idea that people could shortcut the learning required to produce regularly, correctly exposed images with film to the seconds it took to form the relationship between the settings you had and the results you achieved with digital. So they developed a term for people who checked results on their camera: chimping. This apparently refers to the whooping noise that somebody makes when they get a decent image, or what they think is a decent image, which is reminiscent of a chimpanzee. Of course, while they're busy whooping, they probably miss the chance of an even better picture. So it's a derogatory term, trying to put down those who are less experienced than the person making the criticism. Of course, now with live view and digital and mirrorless cameras, we're all chimping before we press the button, so that one's died a death. So what's the experienced practitioner going to use to beat the novice with now? Well, how about auto settings? Oh, you shouldn't use auto. Real photographers don't use auto. We could talk about auto exposure, we could talk about auto focus, we could talk about auto ISO. I've seen forums and videos where all have been decried. But is that actually accurate? Is it true that you can't get a decent picture using auto settings? Well, the image that you've been looking at while I've been having this minor rant was actually taken on a camera with everything set to auto. The only thing I did was set the focal length of the zoom and press the button. And what I'm going to show now is another 7 pictures where I did exactly that. And you can decide whether I would have obtained anything significantly better had I taken the purist approach and set everything manually. This exercise in checking the effectiveness of the camera doing everything was dictated to some extent by necessity rather than perversity. One morning I had about 30 minutes to go out and walk my dog because I had an appointment later in the day, but it was shaping up to be a halfway interesting sunrise, so I wanted to take a camera with me. I didn't have a lot of time to stop and mess around with settings because I had to get back, so I set my Lumix GX1 into its intelligent auto mode. And if you're interested in Panasonic's intelligent auto mode, Terry Lane has done an interesting video on that. So what we have here is a series of 7 images that I took on what amounted to a 30-minute dog walk. All of these were taken handheld using the Lumix image stabilization on using intelligent auto. So basically all I was doing was setting the zoom position as previously and hitting the button. Now the first image here, the sun is just about starting to break through. The light levels are quite low and the camera has chosen a 60th of a second, aperture 5.6, ISO's high at 1250. But if you look at the image, you'll see that it is reasonably well exposed and it is reasonably sharp, and the post-processing has dealt with the worst of the noise. The second image, taken probably about 5 or so minutes later, sun has risen a little bit more colour in the sky, slightly more interesting picture. I haven't spent a lot of time composing these because, as I said, I'm under pressure of time. I was trying to get something halfway decent, but I wasn't agonising about composition. In this second shot, Again, 60th of a second, aperture a little wide f4.9, ISO now with more light down to 320, and base ISO on the GX1 is 200. The next picture taken probably again another 5 minutes or so later, sun again a little bit higher in the sky, backlighting these trees. Quite a lot of dynamic range in this picture, but the camera has really coped with that quite well. Obviously there are limits to that, but in this case it's dealt reasonably well with it. 60th of a second, f4.9 again, ISO 500. So well within the ISO tolerances of that particular camera. Next picture, probably a little bit longer interval this time, probably another 10 minutes. Just gone down the bottom of a hill. There is a lake behind these trees, so it's throwing up a little bit of mist, and the light levels are lower. It's perhaps a little bit more interesting with the texture in the sky and the mist. This time the camera, again, 60th of a second, f5.6, 1600 ISO. So the ISO is pushed up a bit, but given that there's mist, using high ISO noise reduction has really led to an acceptable image. The following picture is now about another 5-10 minutes later, and this is a picture that I've ever seen, that I've taken many times in much better light than this. Isn't a particularly interesting picture, but it does serve again to show that the camera has pretty much nailed the focus and come up with a reasonable balance of exposure. Again, 60th of a second, 5.6, ISO 800. Most of these are in the sort of full frame equivalent focal length of around 60 millimeters. Next picture taken another 5 minutes later, sun breaking through. This is the sun rising over the lake at Croon Park. The houses in the background, getting a bit of reflection. Really quite a high dynamic range in this shot, but again the auto exposure has really nailed that pretty well. There's a little bit of highlight burning out at the point where the sun is breaking the horizon, but really you would be hard pushed to do much better with manual exposure on this scene, and you might well end up resorting to exposure blending to do much better. Again, the composition's okay. Really, I've rather had a little bit more separation on the right hand side, but just to reiterate, I was pushed for time and I was not agonizing too much about framing. The final picture, taken again maybe a few minutes later, from a compositional point of view, certainly from my perspective, was the best of the bunch, and the scene still retains a little bit of autumn colour. There's a little bit of frost on the grass, so it provides a little bit of contrast in texture and colour, and the lake leading down to the bridge gives a little bit of compositional interest. This time, again, we're talking 60th of a second, a little bit wider, this time about 40 millimeters, full frame equivalent, and the ISO at 640. So hopefully what this has shown is that the camera, which is about 7 years old now, 16 megapixel, a good deal away from state of the art, but is still capable, fully automatic mode, of taking perfectly reasonable photos. And so the question then raises, well, why am I using auto? Well, in this case, because I was pushed for time. But it raises the suspicion that I'm using auto because I can't shoot pictures manually. So next section, I'll put up a couple of pictures where I have used the Lumix camera with everything manual, because there were situations where I didn't think that the auto modes would cope well. Now, despite most of my landscape images being taken with a more standard combination of manual and auto modes, usually I use aperture priority. I usually use autofocus, but on occasions I'll use manual focus. But the two images I've used to illustrate situations where I've used everything manual are not actually landscape images. The first is an image of the building at Croom, the Rotunda, which has recently been redecorated, and the National Trust locally asked me if I'd take some pictures to show it in its new pristine state. Now, this is an awkward building to photograph. There's no artificial light, so the only light is streaming in through the windows. The building is about 8 meters in diameter, so it's quite difficult to get everything in. And the critical thing for this image, apart from trying to balance out the exposure, was to ensure that the plaster relief, the decoration on the walls, was sharp and sharp front to back. So I set this up on a tripod, used manual exposure, taking care to retain some texture in the scene through the windows, the trees outside the building, although obviously they are burnt out. And I use manual focus, checking focus points with a mirrorless camera, looking at focal points at various depths through the image to make sure I got sufficient depth of field to keep everything sharp. So this was a case where everything was manual. The exposure was set to base ISO, I was on the tripod, I used timer release, and I set the aperture and the shutter speed. The final image I'm putting up here is one that I took in my garden, and this really was to investigate the possibility of using a 50mm lens with an adapter on the GX9 and triggering this remotely with a smartphone app. So the idea was to try and get pictures of birds taking off from a feeder in the garden. So again, everything was set to manual, including this time the flash and triggering of an off-camera flash as a slave. So the aperture was set to ensure that I had a field of depth of field window that matched the point where the birds would be taking off. The shutter speed was set to the maximum sync speed for the camera because I really wanted the flash to overpower the ambient light. The flash itself in the camera was set to manual. If you use TTL settings, you get a pre-flash which triggers a dumb slave early, and the off-camera flash was set to manual, and I dialed down the flash duration to give me the exposure I wanted. So again, just to stress it, everything was manual. So the point really I'm making is that there are times when you have to use manual, but really there are times when you don't, and particularly when you're developing your skills and you're learning and you're starting out, being pressured to switch to a manual mode rather than take advantage of the automatic facilities that your camera offers you is probably doing you a disservice. So don't be put off by people saying you should do this, you should do that. The really experienced photographers treat cameras as a tool. They use all of the features offered to maximize the chances of getting the shot they want. As you get more experienced and you start to try to do take pictures in more challenging circumstances, then is the time to start thinking about going to manual settings. So I hope you find this helpful.